Hi, welcome everybody, and thank you for being here for the fifth session and the capstone session of our speaker series, Race, Place, and Policing, What We Can Learn from Baltimore. I'm Larry Schwartz-Toll. I'm the Executive Director of the Criminal Justice Program of Study, Research, and Advocacy. We are really pleased to have this excellent panel here tonight. Pleased to be co-sponsoring this with BALSA, the Systemic Justice Lab, OPIA, and with support from the Dean's Office. Let me just ask quickly, how many folks here have been to at least one of the previous sessions that we've done so far? And who's been to all four of the previous ones? So, what we've tried to do with the speaker series is structure a really concrete conversation about the dynamics of race and policing and how those dynamics are structured by access to opportunity and by the structural conditions that define access to opportunity, and looking at those questions in Baltimore so that the conversation can be concrete, and looking at both the dynamics that structure encounters between police and civilians, the role of race in those encounters, and some of the different advocacy strategies for getting at those issues. So we started with a session with Jason Downs, who's a civil rights lawyer in Baltimore. He's one of the lawyers representing Freddie Gray's family. And Jason placed the killing of Freddie Gray in a broader context of police-community relations in Baltimore, and really set the table for the discussion that we've tried to have over the course of this speaker series. He outlined how the patterns of police abuse in Baltimore are long-standing and how they interact with concentrated poverty, with unequal access to economic opportunity, educational opportunity, and healthcare. The second talk, we had Sherilyn Eiffel, who's the Director Counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and she expanded on those themes. She talked about the long history of policies and practices by many institutions, including the government, that have created the geography of opportunity in Baltimore, and how that geography of opportunity is built into everyday interactions between police and civilians. We then took a kind of deeper dive into looking at two of the institutions that are really the sort of core engines of access to opportunity, housing and education. We had a session with Matt Hill from the Public Justice Center. He traced the history of racially discriminatory housing practices and policies in Baltimore that have created such a tight link between race and space. And then we had Andreas Alonzo, the former CEO of Baltimore City Schools, who talked about how schools can be anchors for communities, but also how they can reinforce patterns of inequality, pushing students out of the educational system and into the criminal justice system. So those previous four sessions have been meant to frame a conversation about some of the underlying structural conditions that lead to racially biased police practices. And this evening's panel is meant to look at some of the strategies for addressing those conditions. We are really fortunate to have a panel of sophisticated advocates who come at these issues from a number of different vantage points, and to talk about the strategies and that they employ and the work that they do in Baltimore. And so we'll have a chance to hear from each of the panelists. I'll ask a few questions, and then we'll have time for folks here to ask questions as well. So I'm going to briefly introduce all of the folks we have with us tonight, and as is often the case, we could spend half of the time of the panel describing people's credentials and the work they've done, so I'm going to give just the one-sentence introduction for each of our panelists. Sonia Kumar is a staff attorney at the ACLU of Maryland, where she has a special focus on Maryland's criminal justice system, racial justice, and gender inequality. Tawanda Jones is an activist who works on police reform and racial justice in Baltimore. Doug Colbert is a law professor at the University of Maryland, where he teaches the Access to Justice Clinic and teaches courses in professional responsibility, race and criminal justice, constitutional law, criminal law, and human rights law. Delegate Alonzo Washington is a member of the Maryland House of Delegates, a position he's held since 2012. And Dayvon Love is the Director of Public Policy and Research for Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle and is one of the authors of the Black Book, Reflections from the Baltimore Grassroots. Thank you all very much for being here tonight. I think we're going to start with Tawanda.
Okay, thank you guys for having me. I'm so excited. The whole ride here on the airplane, I just couldn't believe that I'm actually coming here. So anyway, to tell you a little bit about myself and my advocacy, basically it was something that I was forced into. It was nothing I never chosen or anything. So before Freddie Gray, there was my brother Tyrone West, who was brutally murdered in Baltimore City by 11 to 15 Baltimore City police officers. So now for 950 days, and this week will be our, what you would say, we called it West Wednesday. So it will be our 136th week West Wednesday. That's how long we've been out there fighting for justice, not only for my brother, but for all the victims of police brutality. So in my brother's case, when he was brutally beat to death, just within a half an hour after leaving me. He picked me up from work. Our day started off beautiful. He had a part-time job. He had work. He put maybe 4 hours in his job. He took my car for the rest of the day, picked me up 5:30 sharp. In the middle of our dinner, he gets a phone call where he called himself doing acquaintance a favor. He asked could he borrow my Mercedes-Benz to go pick this young lady up. Me not knowing that was going to be the last time ever seeing or eating dinner with my brother. I'm sorry. But it changed my life forever, and it forced me into this. So immediately when this happened, nobody never contacted my family. Literally, I had to feel pain in my body around the time my brother was being brutally murdered. At 7 o'clock, instantly, I'm sitting there eating my food. I put my food down, and I had so much excruciating pain on my left side. It was so unreal. I thought I needed medical attention. The pain lasted 10 minutes, and instantly when I got up, it stopped. And I'm thinking, what in the world's wrong with me? Immediately, I knew something was wrong with my brother. Numerous times I'm trying to reach him via phone. He never picked up. I'm calling my family and letting everybody know. And it was later confirmed on the 10 o'clock news. I see my dead brother's body laying on a gurney. I see sobbing witnesses telling me that my brother was beat worse than Rodney King. And his dying words was Trayvon Martin. Because if I take you back to 2013, that was when George Zimmerman case had touched the hearts of everybody in the world, around the world, because it touched me and my brother's heart. And that was our last conversation. Well, anyway, immediately we got out there. We knew that something wasn't right. Day one, we were out there fighting for my brother. And then immediately, I'm like, these are not isolated incidents. These are all systemic. So instantly, once we found out that 17 days before my brother was brutally beat to death, there was, there were it was a guy named Abdul Salam who he was a resident of that community. He had his son in the backseat, pulling into his driveway, and these same two exact police officers that was in an unmarked car almost killed this man 17 days before. And nobody knew anything about it. Had it not been for my family going out there for West Wednesday, advocating, when he pulled up, he see a sign. He's like, wait a minute, they almost killed me on July the 1st. And I'm like, you got to be kidding me. So immediately, it took them 154 days just to give my family an autopsy report stating that my brother died of a heart attack and dehydration, which we know is some foolishness. To this day, no autopsy pictures. To this day, we have been out there, and we basically got the outgoing state's attorney, Greg Bernstein, out of office, which is very important. That's why we back Marilyn Mosley. That's why we let everybody, we advocate in our community that voting is very important. I just left Annapolis this week with Dayvon Love, who was pushing against the Officers' Bill of Rights, which allows them 10 days. So we just been fighting, and these things are, like I said, not isolated, but systemic issues, and it's happened. I've been all around the world meeting different families, and I wouldn't want to wish anybody family under this umbrella. And me, myself, who started having kids young, living in, it's the tale of two cities in one city, Baltimore City. So when you live on the poor side, it's like the poor side and then it's like the good side. And so basically, I lived on both sides because I had a chance to live in Charles Village, which I call a good side. But as soon as I let my first house that I was buying go, because I had like three but I had three different water bills because it was like an apartment setup unit. So the gas and electric was more than my mortgage payment. So with that being said, I was forced to move literally right around the corner. So me moving right around the corner in the same neighborhood, but just like the line of Charles Village. Here it is. I used to call for Domino's Pizza. Now I'm living right 1 block away. They won't even deliver to my house. It's like, are you kidding me? It's just like, so this is the stuff that's really happening in the city. And then when I was like, and I could be honest with you and be real transparent, I even had children at a young age, and thank God I made it through school and things of that nature, and teaching my kids to, thank God I'm not a grandmother, but anyway, with that being said, I remember when I had needed help and I turned to the system because I'm like, here it is, I'm going to school, and right now, thank God I'm a teacher now and I love doing what I do, but anyway, when I was on the other side and I just needed a little help, they wanted to put me in public housing, and I'm like, oh no, I'm not, and that was like, and they made me wait on a two-year waiting list. And so when they finally called me, I'm thinking like, yes, this is an opportunity. Since I got my little part-time job, I'm going to school. I'm a mother. This will help me out until, I'm able to buy my home and things of that nature. And when they told me they were going to put me in the projects, I'm like, no way. And thank God my mother stepped up and helped pay half of my bills for a year until I was able to pay it myself, because she's like, no, there's no way you and my grandbabies are going to nobody's project. But this is the type of foolishness that we are dealt with every day. The no opportunities, like it's just a battle just to walk out your door, just to walk around and be a community person, just to live. It's really hard. Like, people don't know that side to you. And then the saddest part, I was growing up all my life believing in the justice system because I'm a law-abiding system. Never in my life been arrested. Always pay my taxes. I go to jury duty. I do my fair time in jury duty, and I always believe that the system is there. It's designed to help people. And when I see all these broken things, I'm like, you got to be kidding me. So I just wanted to share that with you guys, and thank you so much for letting me share.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for being here, and thanks, Tawanda, for telling us about your experience. I want to provide a little more background about the amazing advocacy Tawanda and her family has done. I think, I'm a lawyer at the ACLU, and over a period of years, there has been a systemic issue of police killing people in Baltimore, in Maryland, and those cases have typically gone through, represented by sort of like this small group of lawyers who do these cases. And as Tawanda has noted, before Freddie Gray, there was her brother, Tyrone West. Before him, there were many others. There was, in particular, I want to name one kid, Christopher Brown, who was a 17-year-old who was choked to death by an off-duty police officer outside of his home. And that was in 2012. And I met Chris's mom right after he was killed, and she was this amazing advocate and was fighting for justice, fighting for training for police officers, convinced one of our state legislators to put in a bill relating to police training. But it was through the process of getting to know her and then meeting family after family that was describing sort of a similar problem where they were victims of violence that nobody was acknowledging. We at the ACLU really struggled with sort of how can we. I remember saying to Tawanda's, is it your uncle Neil? Yes. Her uncle, her cousin, when we were talking that part of what would help here is if somebody just counted, right? Let's just count. basically we just reached a point where we realized nobody else was doing it, and we felt it was really important, and we wanted to be able to contextualize what we're seeing. And so so we did, and we were, I think, in a lot of ways, we were really shocked that we had to do that. I mean, it was sort of like this thing where it wasn't even a statistic. It wasn't even a statistic. People, I mean, we collect data on like the most mundane things in our society, but we weren't acknowledging people being killed in police encounters. And I think I highlight this because Maryland's a fairly small state. We found over the course of it took a really long time combing through news articles, at least 109 people who had died in police encounters over a 5-year period. And it wasn't just Baltimore. It was all over our state. It was certainly concentrated in Baltimore, but it was all over our state. And that was a really, I think, that was significant in some ways, but part of the reason I'm bringing this up here is because this story of what happened, people were used to hearing it. I mean, it was this. What was remarkable about the advocacy that Tawanda's family has done was saying, "Yeah, we're not going to let you forget this one. We're not going to let you forget." And like, just through perseverance, through showing up at the police commissioner's door, through showing up at the state attorney's office, the office of the medical examiner, going to every institution and saying, "What are you doing?" That was a really significant, I think, that had a profound effect that rippled throughout, I think, the city, and in conjunction, especially, of course, with sort of the national landscape. But one of the things that I think I wanted to talk about a little bit today was just sort of how inadequate the law is to address the questions we're talking about today. And part of that is, you know, when I started at the ACLU, my focus was on juvenile justice, and 99% of the kids at the juvenile jail in Baltimore were Black. And it felt like that should be enough to make some sort of race discrimination claim in a city that's 65% Black. Maryland is 30% Black. 80% of the kids in juvenile justice facilities statewide were Black. But there was no way to make that claim. In the early 2000s, we had a mayor, Martin O'Malley, you might be familiar with from his efforts to win a spot in the national stage, who really was responsible for instituting zero-tolerance policing in Baltimore City and developing sort of these mass arrest policies that were resulting in the arrests of at least 1/5 of the city's population. Even more remarkably, about 1/3 of those arrests were dismissed just right at the outset for lacking probable cause. When, with the NAACP, the ACLU filed suit on behalf of 14 people who were victims of these unlawful arrests, our lawsuit included race discrimination claims. Those were among the first to go, as dismissed from a court, even though the policies were, I mean, sort of without any doubt, affecting disproportionately Black people in Baltimore. Marijuana arrests. We had this sort of amazing data because of work that the National ACLU had done relating to race disparities in marijuana arrests. And I know Delegate Washington could speak to this later, but again, we were able to show through data that even though we know that there are comparable rates of use, Black people in Maryland were arrested 3 times the rate of white people. In Baltimore City, 98% of the kids who were arrested for marijuana were Black. 98%. So you think, I'm going to be a lawyer, and we're going to bring these cases. And I think part of the pitch I have in settings like this is that we, as a community, as a profession, have to really work on building and developing a jurisprudence that allows us to name these things and to fight systemic and structural race discrimination, not just what our law recognizes now, which is hyper-individualized race discrimination, right? And And I think, I think part of what we need, in addition to that, is to work on our courts. Work on, in Maryland, we had two, I think, really significant cases that were winding their way through our state courts during the last couple of years, relating to, among many others, relating to police abuses. One case involved the 2008 killing of a man named Manuel Espina, who was killed outside, really sought after by a police officer who'd seen him having a beer on his birthday in his apartment complex, which was perfectly legal, never contested. This officer, like the officers involved in Tyrone's death, had a history of violence against Latinos, instigated an altercation that resulted in a brutal killing of Mr. Espina in front of his son. And in fact, when his son tried to go to his father's aid to help him, he was arrested for interfering. Remarkably, the family was able to find a lawyer and find it in them through their grief to pursue a civil case. No criminal charges were filed ever against this officer. In the civil case, a jury awarded them $11 million, which was a stunning statement about sort of the gravity of what they'd seen. And that was reduced because of, these machinations of the law to $400,000. Which meant that it was, if this verdict stands, it's actually cheaper for police departments to let officers kill people than to invest in stopping them from doing it in the first place. And so the case was appealed, and it went all the way to our Supreme Court, and it was, it was decided, and we were really hopeful that the court was going to recognize that $400,000 or sort of reducing a jury verdict that way. That's a statement about sort of how a family is being wronged when there's no criminal charges, when there's no other remedy, was critically important. And our state Supreme Court, in a unanimous opinion, wrote that the family had no other remedy, that it was appropriate to cap it at $400,000 because of the way the law worked. And not only did they write that opinion, but they did it without a trace of apology, without a trace of acknowledging sort of the humanity of what they were deciding or its significance. And I think that's because they felt accountable, not to the people, the families, the common person, but to other lawyers and to this city governments. Fortunately, there was a legislation that increased that cap subsequent after this decision, but I think it said a lot about the court. The other case I want to just quickly mention is a case involving a woman who lived on the eastern shore of Maryland, which is very old school, to say the least. And she lived in a county that was a site of Maryland's last lynching. And she was a young black woman who had been called by this Maryland state police officer, a white officer, about a case he was investigating. He wanted her to be a witness, and he left a voicemail for her. They'd spoken before, and he said, "I'm calling you back." And he thought he hung up the phone, but he didn't. And he recorded himself using racial slurs to describe her in conversation with another state trooper. This young woman really didn't know what to do. She was terrified about sort of making a complaint, but her mom was a total activist and was really involved with the local NAACP. And so with the help of the NAACP, she went forward and filed this complaint. 2 months later, she got a letter saying, "We've investigated your complaint. We found it to be meritorious. We've taken disciplinary action." And that was it. she wanted to know what had happened. She wanted to know what action they took against the officer. She wanted to know, did they do anything to address the fact that he felt like it was totally okay to drop racial slurs in conversation, especially against the backdrop of longstanding litigation against the state police for racial profiling. And we, again, went all the way to our state Supreme Court. The police argued that internal affairs records are personnel records that can't be disclosed to the public. And our state Supreme Court bought that argument, which meant that our client could not even see a written copy of the statement that she made against a police officer, let alone records showing how thoroughly or not they investigated her complaint. That case was decided by a majority of the bench, but the two black judges on our court dissented. And I think these are conversations that we don't often have about sort of the racial politics of legal decision-making. And I think it's really, really important for us to open that up, to figure out, what we can do to change it so we're not ending up with these absurd decisions against the backdrop of all of this other amazing organizing.
Well, first I want to thank Larry and Maureen for organizing and inviting all of us, and I particularly want to thank all of you for being here. I mean, you've got lots of places to go, and choices to make, especially in this school and in this city, and the fact that you're here says a lot about each of you. And when I was in law school, I had one professor who was like the mentor for all of us. And when I mentioned Arthur Kanoy, he's somebody who always reminded us of what Oliver Wendell Holmes once said about the burning issues of the day are the ones you must immerse yourselves. Because by standing on the sidelines, you basically allow wrongs to take place and injustices just by your silence alone. So Holmes always talked about just immersing yourself in what I'm going to be talking about in part, which is the burning issue of people in jail without lawyers because they don't have money to rebuy their freedom. But I also want to take a moment or two just to set up what happened to Freddie Gray on April 12th of last year and what's been taking place since. And in order to do that, I just have to talk about when I first arrived in Baltimore, Maryland. I teach now at Maryland Law School. And I went to court for the first time, and I was absolutely stunned. I saw 25 people, men, coming into court, handcuffed and shackled and chained and hooked onto each other. And they were walking into a courtroom, sort of shuffling their way in because they couldn't do it any other way. There were 23 African Americans and 2 Caucasians in this group. And they all appeared in front of a judge. And the judge basically said, you have a right to speak, but anything you say can and will be used against you. What do you have to say now? And most of them, of course, said very little. And the judge proceeded to set bail for about 2/3 of them. They released about 1/3. And the other 2/3 then had a money bail. And I turned to people and I said, where's the lawyer? Where's the person who's supposed to be advocating? Because, you see, I came from New York City. And New York City is a place I worked for about 11 or 12 years with the New York City Legal Aid Society. And the battleground, the main battleground, was not a trial, because trials don't happen frequently. These days it's about 5% of the cases go to trial, jury trial, that is. But the battle was at that first appearance at the arraignment court when people's most precious human right was at stake. And that's our freedom, that's our liberty. There's lots of human rights, and they're all really valuable. Personally, it's my liberty and freedom that counts the most. And so when we were in court, we put up the biggest battles possible to get our clients out of jail at the beginning, because if we got them out at the beginning, it was invariably good results would follow. Very few people got convicted, very few people went to jail, and most of the time we were able to build a really solid defense, we were able to get charges dismissed, And most importantly, we built relations with our clients. So the reason I like coming to this group is that before long, each of you are going to take a very important place in the public arena. And you're going to have opportunities to do things, to correct wrongs. And so thinking back to Holmes and the words of Arthur Conoy about, burning issue today of freedom. And here are all these people coming into court, not knowing what to say, what not to say, basically taking about 30 seconds, 40 seconds, getting a bail, being put back in jail. And the next time they're going to go to court will be at least 30 days. It's an automatic 30-day postponement in Maryland, and usually it's about 35 or 40 days before you get back. And the silence that accompanied this reality really blew my mind. And I decided that, along with my students, and I have to say that everything that I'm about to say would not have happened without the clinical law students. We changed our clinic from a criminal defense clinic to an access to justice clinic. And the students then began representing people in jail and doing really an incredibly good job of getting people out. And they raised the consciousness of lots of folks. But we also did law reform. And we spent 6 years, with in Annapolis, where my dear colleague, Delegate Washington, now serves. And we spent about 6 solid years there. And we didn't accomplish what we sought out to do. One house was very good in the Senate. The other place in the House of Delegates, it never got through the Judiciary Committee. But we didn't stop there. And I think the most important thing to keep in mind always is that when you see a wrong, when you see an injustice, don't put your hands up in the air and say, what are we supposed to do? Do something. And just continue, because we almost always have the better of the argument. It just takes longer than it should to correct the injustice. So we then spent the next 7 years filing a class action lawsuit, along with 2 wonderful pro bono lawyers from the state's largest firm. Long story short, 7.5 years later, on July 1st, 2014, people's constitutional right to a lawyer at the first appearance became the law that was implemented in Maryland. I said 14? Yes, 14. Okay. So I say all this because when you look at Freddie Gray's situation that he confronted on April 12th, and you wonder, I sat in on Officer Porter's first trial in the killing of Freddie Gray, and I was there for the entire trial from beginning to end. So the story that's told is that 3 police officers, the bikers, led by Lieutenant Rice and added with officers Nero and Miller, they saw Freddie Gray. Now, I don't know this for a fact, but I would bet an awful lot that they knew Freddie Gray prior to April 12th. Freddie Gray had been arrested 17 times. If you read the papers, they talk about this extensive criminal record. Freddie Gray was convicted twice. One of those convictions doesn't even count because it was a probation before judgment. 15 arrests were dismissed, but they were only dismissed after Freddie Gray either paid a bail bondsman a 10% non-refundable fee. So if the bail's $10,000, you have to pay $1,000. And for a working person, that would mean basically 4 paychecks, net pay being roughly $250, $275 for a $10 an hour job. So either you pay the bail bondsman a non-refundable fee to get out of jail, or you stay in jail for the 30 to 40 days. When Freddie Gray was, and I know I'm not going to take up more than my 10 minutes here, but when Freddie Gray...
We're building in a buffer zone.
Yeah, so when Freddie Gray may have seen the police say that, Freddie Gray looked in their direction. They made eye contact. So you know the law. You know Wardlow versus Illinois. You've had criminal procedures, so you know high crime area, eye contact, and unprovoked action. So Freddie Gray is supposed to have run. Well, from the officer's point of view, that gave him reasonable suspicion. 3 of them went after Freddie Gray. We haven't heard those trials yet, but we do know that Freddie Gray was apprehended because we have the video. Thank goodness for videos. And we have one police officer literally putting his arms behind his back, touching almost as high up as they can, his knees and his back. And soon Freddie Gray, and you know the rest of the story because you've seen it. He's carted away, he's handcuffed, he's shackled. One of the witnesses said he was placed in a van like you would place, a slab of meat or something. It was just put right into the van. And then he's inside this metal van. There is no restraints on him. There's nothing that prevents him from bouncing off one wall to the other wall. So it's like a pinball situation. And 5 stops later, Freddie Gray finally arrives at the precinct, and he's unconscious. He never regains consciousness. He sustained a broken neck, and 1 week later, he died. The surprising thing here was not the fact that Freddie Gray was arrested. It was not the fact that he was chased or apprehended. It was not even the fact that he was placed and given what they call a rough ride, because that's happened to many other people in Baltimore, and the city's had to pay quite a bit of money for it. But they're prepared to pay the money, in my opinion. They're less prepared to actually deal with police conduct. So what happens then is, and this is the surprising piece is that we have a local prosecutor who's one of the 1 or 2% of local prosecutors in the country that actually brought criminal charges against 6 police officers. 98.3% of the nearly 3,000 people killed in police custody in the last decade in this country, 98.3% no charges filed. Charges dismissed either by the elected official or by the grand jury. So here we have a local prosecutor, and she is getting criticized from every former prosecutor, from everyone in the police union that supported her, because Marilyn Mosby comes from a family of police officers. The last thing the union expected was that she was going to turn and indict any of their own. And they even contributed to her campaign, and I have 2 minutes left. So what happens then is that there's an indictment. And of course, the move is get the case out of Baltimore. Why? Because we don't want a Baltimore jury to be rendering justice for 6 police officers, i.e., we do not want a predominantly African-American jury to be rendering justice for the officers on trial. But that failed, and it also failed. They tried to remove Mosby and said that she had all this political ambition and that she has her husband's on a city council and all these irrelevant situations in order to get the trial moved to a predominantly white county. Okay, now long story short, because I probably have 60 seconds. So sitting through the trial was so much different than what you were reading in the paper. The case, the evidence against Officer Porter was very strong. I mean, the prosecution had 2 prosecutors who were not linked to the prosecutors of the past. They were newly hired people, both of whom had done a great deal of criminal defense work, both of whom were highly respected members of the defense bar, and now they were prosecuting. And for the most part, they did a very good job. They came within a vote or 2 from the jury of convicting Officer Porter on 2 of the 4 charges. But now, in the upcoming weekend, this is where I'm going to stop and hope I get a question that I can say a little bit more. Just a hint there. But this week, the defense did something that is hardly ever done in a criminal trial. They basically got an appeals court to stay the proceedings, to rule on an issue that usually doesn't get decided until and if the defendant's convicted. You just don't get interlocutory appeals in criminal cases, but when you have police defendants, things happen much differently. And so now there's been a 2-month gap in the trial. This Thursday, the issue of whether the prosecution can grant Officer Porter immunity so that he can testify against other officers, because you know about the code of silence. You know that officers are not going to testify against each other unless they get immunity, and even then it's sometimes questionable. So the issue of immunity, which is something, if you Google this, you'll find there's a 1972 Supreme Court case which says prosecutors have the weapon of granting immunity to any of us to testify against any of my friends here. I can't do anything about it except I can go to jail, I guess, and be held in contempt. But that allows the prosecution to prosecute crime that hardly anyone else is doing. So that's the situation we're in right now. It's been really a remarkable period where, the jury came very close to a conviction. There's still 5 more officers, plus Officer Porter, whose case ended in a mistrial, being retried, hopefully at some time in the near future. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, can everyone hear me? Yes. Perfect, thank you. Thank you for having me here. My name is Alonzo Washington. I'm a state delegate in Prince George's County, Maryland. And I've been a delegate for about 3 years now. This is going on my 4th legislative session. And I had the unique opportunity to serve in the legislature and actually recently become the first vice chair of the Maryland Legislative Black Caucus. So many of my colleagues and I have worked really hard over this last 4 sessions to really change our criminal justice system. So I'm going to go over a little bit of what we actually did in Maryland and then come back to 2015 and say what happened in the 2014 session before the Freddie Gray incident happened on April 12th, right before our legislative session ended. And, in 2013, when I first got there in the legislature, we repealed the death penalty. As you all know, that's a big ticket item. That was something I think we stepped in the forefront with about 17 other states in the country who have done that and repealed the death penalty. So I'm pretty proud that we actually had the opportunity to actually vote on something like that. Whereas we know that roughly about 42% of those on death row were African Americans. It disproportionately affects African Americans. In 2014, we decriminalized small amounts of marijuana. Now, with this issue, it was actually really interesting because, the bill passed the Senate first and came over to the House. And then the Judiciary Committee in the House of Delegates decided to change the bill into a summer study. Decriminalized marijuana coming over from the Senate, and then the Judiciary Committee decided to turn it into a study. And so we got wind of it in the Black Caucus, and other younger legislators got wind of it, and we said, no, we're not going to stand for it. We're not going to let leadership take this bill over and change it into a study where we know we already done enough studies. We know it disproportionately affects African Americans totally. It does. And even though both white and black people use it equally, African Americans are punished more for it and go to jail more. So we got together and we built a coalition, and we actually sent the bill back to the committee, which is never heard of. We actually sent it back to the committee, and they sent it back out as it once was, came over from the Senate. And so building those coalitions really helped us, and working with the ACLU really helped us in getting that bill passed. And we actually passed that, and now we decriminalize small amounts of marijuana. And last year, I know I'm taking a little step. This past session, we had to overturn the governor's veto to make sure we outlaw the fact that they have paraphernalia. So we have to turn that over because under the bill in 2014, you can get arrested for just having the baggie on you. So you can get arrested for that. So that was oversight on our part, and we came back the next year to try to overturn that, and the governor repealed that. He vetoed that bill, and we overturned that veto. In 2015, we repealed this was in 2014. We did the Second Chance Act, where we allow for there to be when you have small amounts of drug offenses, we wanted to shield those from trying to get employment. We know that was disproportionately affecting African Americans when they come out of jail with these small drug offenses, that they weren't able to get a job. So let's talk about now in 2015, where last year we actually passed a bill to allow ex-felons the right to vote. Huge bill. We passed it. We got about 81 votes you need in the House of Delegates. It passed in the Senate, came over to the House, and we voted it out. And then the governor vetoed that bill as well, to allow about 40,000 citizens the right to vote when they're released from jail. And so recently we had to overturn that veto as well, which was a great thing that we did in the House and in the Senate. And I'm proud to say that we got that done. And these are the things that we're doing to move forward as a state of Maryland, to really change the dynamics of things that are happening in our criminal justice system. And as many of you know, last year the governor, this guy said to us that, as we were trying to work on the Bill of Rights for the police department, we tried to change that, and he said, "No, I'm not going to stand for that. This is not Ferguson," is what he said. Maryland is not Ferguson. And then, as soon as the legislature ended in April, days later, Ferguson happened in Baltimore. Freddie Gray, the incident happened, and there was an arrest in Baltimore. And, this governor had to eat his words, wholeheartedly. He had to eat his words. And so this year, we're focusing more on making sure that we can pass comprehensive law reform that's going to make it fair throughout our system, whether it's policing or even looking at issues that are looking at sentencing reforms that are occurring in Maryland right now. And so we're looking at these things as a comprehensive effect to really change and impact the criminal justice system. The Black Caucus is taking a lead on this, and we're saying that we're not going to. There's two bills. There's a couple bills out there. There's one bill that's looking at I keep forgetting this bill. The Bill of Rights for the police department. We're looking at that significantly, and we're saying that with this Bill of Rights, we want to see significant changes, and we can't see one without the other. We want to see it all together, or otherwise we're not going to vote for it. We're going to hold our 50 votes, and we're going to say we're not going to vote for it. We're not going to stand for it. We're going to try to kill this bill as much as we can if it does not pass. We're looking at the Justice Reinvestment Act, where we can do sentencing reforms. And we're saying, well, we have two bills there, and one bill the leadership wants, the second bill they don't want, which is the mandatory reforms, the mandatory sentencing reforms. And what we're saying as a Black Caucus, and even as the state, as many younger state legislators are saying, that we're not going to put up with this. Either one, we're going to vote for one and the other. We're not going to stand for it. We're going to make sure that we finally and for all repeal the sentencings that have happened to us so poorly in our state. And I'm going to end on that note. And I know that we have a lot of issues that we're working with in the state of Maryland. We're looking at better community policing. Going to our education system, we need more community schools, especially in Baltimore, where I heard from the other speaker that you had, Mr. Alonzo, that said that we have about 209 schools in Baltimore, and only 23 of them or 30 of them are community schools where they have wraparound services to make sure all of our kids have the access to opportunity that they need. And it's about closing that opportunity gap that persists in our state. We have the number one in the state of Maryland, believe it or not. Sorry, Massachusetts, but we have the number one education system in the country. But our achievement gap is the largest in the country, between African Americans and whites. Mm-hmm. And so until we start really diving down into those issues, we're gonna see us continually fall back. I sit on the Ways and Means Committee that oversees a lot of the education policies. And so education is my forte, and education and tax policy are things that I really focus in on. This criminal justice issues that I see, and I studied criminal justice in college. Shout out to the Terps. But we're going to work our way through the Black Caucus to make sure we see a change in our criminal justice system and in our sentencing reform. So I want to just say thanks for having me, and I look forward to having a deep dive into this discussion. Thank you.
All right, good evening. Appreciate the invitation to be here. Dayvon Love with an organization called Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, grassroots political think tank. Many of us are former high school and college policy debaters, and so we formed a think tank that's community-based. Really, if you think about post the 60s and 70s, the conservative revolution, a big part of what made it happen and culminating the election of Ronald Reagan was the development of think tanks that created an institutional platform in order for them to advance their agenda. So and for us also, we saw that many people that were advocating on issues that most directly affected people of African descent oftentimes were not our people, not people other from our communities. So that was really the genesis of our organization that we founded in 2010. We were involved in stopping the construction of a $104 million juvenile detention facility in East Baltimore. We were a part of the effort that Sonia mentioned earlier about Christopher's Law with Tawanda and many others. And we're actively involved in police reform. We do a whole bunch of other stuff. Our website, lbsbaltimore.com. What I want to do, though, is talk about just some of the larger political dynamics at play. And I like to always start off with making it very clear that we have to, if we're serious about addressing these issues, we have to understand that we live in a society structured on the principle of white supremacy, right? And that all the major institutions of civil society are configured along the lines of proliferating the collective economic, social, and political interests of white folks at the expense of black people. And that it's important that we understand white supremacy not just as a group of white folks in a room conspiring to screw over a bunch of people of color, but we understand that there are a series of institutions that are codified in the very structure of how they operate, operationalizing the interests of the supremacy of white folks in political economy and all other really aspects of civil society. And that's important not just as an academic matter, but it's important in helping us understand the social phenomena that we're looking at. Because I think sometimes many of us have a tendency to see the incidences of police brutality, of mass incarceration, or really any other form of discrimination as isolated events of injustice, instead of looking at it in its proper context. It's even more important to look at it from the perspective. So we get the Republicans and conservatives are crazy, right? Baltimore is a Democratic Party stronghold. The state of Maryland is a Democratic Party stronghold, right? We've only had 2 Republican governors in the past 50 years. It's the Democrats that have been the problem, Democrats and the left that have been the problem and impediment to progress of black folks. And the reason why I say that is because while you have Republicans and conservatives, right, that don't even acknowledge the fundamental social reality that our society is structured on racism, what you also have is you have white folks that have internalized the notion of black inferiority and white supremacy, that they feel that they can deliver us better solutions for ourselves than we can, right? And in many instances, financially and politically benefit from our suffering, right? From the oppression that we see. And that's important because essentially what we have is we have white institutional frameworks that are often made responsible and tasked with addressing our issues. And this has manifested itself in the way that even police brutality has been presented to the public. So, for instance, there are a lot of people that feel like police brutality is a new phenomenon, right? Many of us still know that it's been something happening for decades, and it's not that there's been some drastic spike, right, in police brutality. There's a sister named Stacey Patton, some of you might have heard of her. She's a journalist and academic. And what she says is that the reason that we are seeing police brutality in the mainstream is because the incident with Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman created a media formula, a formula for corporate media to get viewership, right? Because I think in many ways we see these images of Black death, right, constantly at this point, given the way that police brutality is in mainstream media. But I had a very prominent anchor on cable network television say it's good television. I feel like the collective American imagination, it absorbs these images of Black death the same way that people absorb like horror movies, right? That there's a certain voyeurism. There's a book called Scenes of Subjection by Saidiya Hartman that does a great job of I think, explaining this, where she describes that the obsession with the kind of overt physical brutality of racism obscures our focus on the fact that the very structure of civil society, the very structure of enslavement is violent without the kind of spectacles of violence that kind of draw people into them, right? And one of the questions that I often ask folks when people are talking about Freddie Gray is, what is the difference between Tyrone West and Freddie Gray, right? The only difference is that there is a media context, right, that people could graft onto, and there was corporate media that could benefit from the viewership of being able to draw people into the narrative. The reason why that's so important, because that's important in understanding that the issue of police brutality is about Black people building the institutional capacity to levy political and economic consequences to those that undermine our humanity, right? That our pleas to civil society to not treat us so bad, to not kill us, are futile unless you have the power, to make people behave differently towards you. And that the struggle is about building the collective infrastructure necessary in order that there are political consequences for undermining the humanity of people of African descent. So if we look at kind of the larger historical context to put this in, because unfortunately, we live in a society where the images of black people are often used by white-controlled institutions, and we'll talk about racism and injustice, right? Using the symbolic capital of a black person doing that, while using that to fortify the institutional power of a white institution, white-controlled dominated institution, to be able to produce policy for communities whom they have no formal mechanisms of accountability to. One way to put it is that there are a lot of folks that can go and talk very articulately about issues of police brutality and get money and resources for it, tenure, positions at major universities, be able to be on the speaker circuit and go around, makes a lot of money doing it. But the very people who are suffering don't see those benefits, right? They're stuck in their same communities without the mechanisms of power to be able to fight the political fights, to go and change the Maryland Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights, for example. And the best way that I can demonstrate that this manifests itself in Maryland is the way in which our state legislature operates, right? And I want to talk about some of the things that Delegate Washington mentioned to just really give you an example. So when you talk about issues that most directly affect black folks, right? And I think it's really appropriate, being at Harvard Law School, a theory authored by Derek Bell, right? This theory of interest convergence is very appropriate. It is the way that white liberals are able to maintain their position of power in society, appear to address issues of racial injustice while not having to give up the power necessary for justice to actually be done. Right? So that Brown versus Board, as Derek Bell argues, is not an issue of white folks having an epiphany about the horrors of segregation, but a capitulation of Cold War politics and a response to the activism that was happening as a way to kind of quell some of the resistance, right? That's important because that same strategy, right? Even the Civil Rights Act of 64, right? Same thing. Malcolm X once said, you don't put a knife in a person's back 9 inches, pull it out 3 and say you've made progress. Right, you have to begin to heal the wound before you can say you made progress. The Civil Rights Act of 64 was pulling the knife out 3 inches. Dr. King himself said in an essay he wrote called Testament of Hope that the Civil Rights Act had failed because only 3 out of the 10 provisions in it were in the Civil Rights Act were enforced, and the poverty programs that were supposed to accompany the Civil Rights Act were cast away in favor of pursuing the war in Vietnam. So that's the strategy. It's always been to appear to do justice, right, without actually having to address the levels of power that cause injustice. Give a couple examples of how this manifests itself in Maryland. So Delegate Washington mentioned the Maryland Second Chance Act. And you can correct me if I'm wrong. Many of the strongest parts of the Second Chance Act were taken out, right? That certain, like, for instance, nonviolent felonies. They wouldn't let nonviolent felonies out of committee to be voted on, right? But they wanted to appear that they did something about ex-felon and expungement. Or if we look at one of the things that he mentioned, which was a good thing. I think the giving ex-felons the right to vote upon release was a good thing. But interest convergence. Why would the Democratic Party embrace an idea that they had been hostile to, right, for years and years and years, right? Why would they embrace that? Not because they all of a sudden recognized that, ex-felons are contributors to society. We have a Republican governor. These are 40,000 more votes for Democrats, right, as a strategic way to fight against the Republican governor in Maryland, right? We look at mandatory minimums, right? There's a resistance. Even though the Justice Reinvestment Act found that addressing mandatory minimums, from which 85% of the folks that are sentenced through these mandatory minimums are black folks, right? It is the element of their findings that they're most resistant to passing legislation to change. But they want to pass a package that allows them to appear to have made change. Lastly, on the Maryland Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights, which we were involved in last year trying to push amendments to it, and are currently involved this year in trying to get amendments to it. Maryland Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights was codified in 1974. It's essentially kind of as labor protections for law enforcement, but it gives protections that undermine our ability to hold them accountable and have transparency. I'll give 2 examples. One is that the trial board, the determined discipline. So this is not a civilian review board, which is normally like an external apparatus that checks the police department, but the trial boards are the internal disciplinary apparatus that dispense discipline. It's made up of 3 people, all 3 of them police officers, right? And under the current law, only other law enforcement agents can serve on the trial board. Another example, the only folks that can participate in the internal investigation of a police officer are other law enforcement officials. These 2 things by themselves undermine our ability to have accountability. And so the leadership, after the uprising, convened a work group, right? Excluded Delegate Joe Carter, who's been a champion on these issues over the years and was actually pushing a lot of these issues before it became popular in the mainstream. And they produced a bill, a leadership bill, to address police brutality. The 2 things that are not in that bill is changing it so that you have a civilian on the trial board and allowing for folks outside of law enforcement to investigate police officers. So I just hope that that gives you an understanding of the way that even those that say they're sympathetic to issues facing Black people use the system to proliferate institutional racism in the name of this notion of progress. Thank you.
So thank you all. And there's, I think, a lot to sort of dig into in what each of you have presented. And so I want to ask a question initially sort of to the full group. One of the things that has come out in this conversation is the sort of distinctive fact of criminal charges being brought against the officers involved in the killing of Freddie Gray. Tawanda, you talked about the role that you played in supporting the campaign for Marilyn Mosby when she was running for district attorney. Doug, you talked about the exceedingly small number of instances in which people who are killed by police officers, in those instances where officers are subject to criminal prosecution. What do you all think is going to be the significance for the governance of the Baltimore Police Department of the fact that these charges have been brought in this case?
Yeah. Well, hopefully it's going to result in the police officers who killed Mr. West to face trial and charges brought by the state. I think what happens is that when you're able to have transparency, when you're actually able to hear truth of what happened, and then you combine it with some of the other positives, like, you know, the Adnan Syed serial podcast that 125 million people have listened to over the world, The Making of a Murderer, where people are actually looking at what happened to Stephen Avery and understanding police tactics. The more that we can become an educated body, the more likely we are not going to tolerate the whitewashing that goes on of police officers. Even if we assume, and I'm willing to assume, that the majority of police officers are professionals, they do a good job, blah, blah, blah. But I also want to say that the ones who are not professionals and who are not doing a good job, they are not being held accountable. And so if we're ever going to gain the trust and confidence of an entire community, if Baltimore is ever going to be the one community that our mayor would like us to embrace, there has to be so much additional work within our justice system to allow people to feel that they're going to get a fair shake. And whenever you know, as much as the Black Lives Matter movement has done so much in terms of connecting, you know, the value of a Black life today with the value of a Black life historically. And I think there are very strong connections between today and the institution of slavery and the Dred Scott opinion, et cetera. I think the idea that people's freedom matters has got to be at the top of the list. The idea of people being free and not having to pay money to regain their freedom has been an issue that hardly anyone has really jumped on. The community organizers that do amazingly good work, and I think that the day-to-day things that happen to people inside the justice system are so deplorable, and yet so few people are aware of what takes place there. So I think coming out of this trial is going to be more awakening, more awareness, more activity. And I think that's the only hope we have, because I don't, with all due respect to Delegate Washington, I really don't have much faith left in the legislative process. Mr. Love has certainly pointed out what goes on in the legislature, and he's absolutely right that things get passed there to make legislators look good. But when you really understand what didn't get passed and how fundamental issues are not going to get a fair shake down in Annapolis, you've got to look to people. You've got to look to community. That's about the only thing we have left.
I just want to jump in because I do think that the value of what the West family and other folks who organized to call out our former state prosecutor for not prosecuting police officers, and not just not prosecuting them, but also maybe sometimes his attitude about not prosecuting them. I think it was really incredibly significant, and we haven't given it enough attention in this conversation, is sort of like the Marilyn Mosby charged those officers because she knew she was elected because her predecessor didn't. That's a really significant thing, and I think it's also significant because from my vantage point and not being from Baltimore, being a lawyer, I saw something really powerful happen, and that goes to sort of, I think, what Dayvon was getting at, which is sort of like the power, the people awakening to their power. And I do think that in terms of how that translates into BPD decision-making is an open question, but I think it means that there's possibility that didn't exist before in terms of the way police departments can be held accountable and can be made to feel accountable.
Can I just take? Okay. Oh, no, good.
No, and I just wanted to jump in and say, like, a lot of the stuff that everybody don't see is when the families get disrespected, when you're trying to beg for transparency. Like, you literally got to beg for transparency. So, and with my brother's case, we literally was chasing all the elected officials around in a circle, and we made them come up with the first resolution hearing that ever happened and someone being brutally murdered. The whole police in Baltimore City accountable. This was way before Freddie Gray. And just like when we were in Annapolis last year, and since the Christopher Brown law, we testified, and thank God it went through and things of that nature. But we had people there sitting on the panel to literally look us in the face and tell all the families to take that carnage back to Baltimore City. You got a black mayor, you got this black, like, really? It's about a human life. Like, this is the stuff you don't see. Y'all didn't see when Greg Bernstein, who is no longer state's attorney, thank God to my family and supporters, we got him out there, but he disrespectful. He told us not to get comfortable in our seats, so he wasn't prosecuting anyone that brutally murdered my brother, and that this was something good for a civil case. I'm like, are you kidding me? Because at the end of the day, it's never about income, it's about the outcome.
Oh, I just want to make one really important point that Tawanda made right there, and that's about the civil case. And I think that I think we all think criminal prosecutions are important and play an important role in accountability, but I think the truth is that the people who are responsible aren't just the line officers. It's also their supervisors. It goes all the way to the top. It goes all the way in terms of the culture of the department, and also the officials, the city officials and the public, what we demand of the department. And I think that's something that gets really lost, is that even if winning a criminal prosecution doesn't necessarily change policy. And I think that's a really important part of the conversation, I think, that we have to keep going.
Delegate Washington, I want to return to one of the points that you made a little bit earlier. You talked about some of the efforts around criminal justice reform, and you also made the point that Maryland is both superlative from the perspective of education and also has the sort of dubious superlative status of being number one in terms of the achievement gap. You also talked about some of the sort of currents in the legislature around criminal justice reform. And I guess my question is both, to what extent is the conversation in the legislative and policy space linking those two strands, and what needs to happen to bring those sort of disparate conversations together and to underline the ways in which they're connected?
Yeah, well, thank you. And I don't want to just, I was going to say this through the last question, but I guess since you took this opportunity to ask me a question, I'm just going to address it. But I'm not going to defend the leadership of the Maryland General Assembly, but I am going to defend my votes that I've casted, whether it's death penalty repeal or decriminalization of small amounts of marijuana, or even the Second Chance Act. I know some of these measures don't go far enough, and don't go as far as I would like them to, but I do think there are steps in the right direction. And I think that doesn't mean that we need to give up and we can't come back and say, let's try again and let's keep on going. I think Jill Carter, one of the delegates that was mentioned, is that, she kept fighting for the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights every year and just kept on throwing it out there, although it wasn't passing. And we're hopeful that we can get something that's similar to what her original bill and what her original intent was. And we're going to constantly keep on fighting for those things. And I'm constantly, and as a caucus, and I'm going to keep saying as a caucus, because this is really issues that are affecting the African American community, and so therefore we have to step up and say, look, we're not going to accept things for what you want us for, just passing things for the sake of passing bills. And so that's why we said that we came up with our own amendments to the bill and said, look, we're proposing this, President of the Senate, we're proposing this, Speaker of the House, and this is what we want in order to get your bill passed. And we're not casting our votes on this bill unless these things are taken care of. And these things are part of that bill. So we're working our way through that line and ensuring that these things happen. So I think the fact that, there's not much hope in the General Assembly from a lot of the outsiders or the activists, but we're constantly working. We're constantly in there working to ensure that we can make these changes in a significant manner and make sure that we can hold the leadership accountable for some of the things that we really want as an African American community. Going back to your question, I think for me, I sit on the education subcommittee. I'm one of the leaders on that committee. And every year since I've been a delegate, I proposed a bill that looked at reforming our suspensions in our school system. Because we all know that it starts at a very young age when you start to discipline kids and sending them back home. There's a sense of sending you back home and pushing you out of society and saying that you're going to jail, essentially. As we all know, studies suggest that out-of-school suspensions don't work for nonviolent offenses. And in my county, in the state, we're suspending African Americans at a larger rate. And in my county, in Prince George's County, 50% of the time we're sending nonviolent offenses, we're sending them out of school back home for 2 to 3 days. Whereas if you go to a county where there's in white suburbia of Maryland, they don't suspend them for those things. So if you yell at a teacher for some reason in my county, you can get 2 to 3 days out of suspension. But if you live in Talbot County, a predominantly white area in suburbia, you can just be sent to the principal or stay in school, or they'll write you up or something. We don't, or they'll give you community service or some type of other restorative justice practice. Whereas in our community, we don't do restorative justice practices. And I think in our school system, we have to reform the way that we suspend our kids so that they understand that they are still part of society and we want them to learn from what they did. And so I have a bill right now that's actually in my committee, in the Ways and Means Committee, that's looking at how can we ensure that we have more restorative justice practices and stop suspending kids out of school at a very young age. And I think that's where the two intersect, that in the criminal justice system, former criminal justice system in our school system, as well as our education system, how they interconnect. But I go back to community schools because I see in our very high poverty areas where there's a lack of opportunity and there's a lack of resources. I grew up in homeless shelters. I lived in poverty most of my life. And I know if it were not for my mom being resourceful and finding the things that she could for her 6 kids and being a single mom, that we wouldn't have been successful. She wouldn't have been a successful mom. And I know if we provide those resources, whether it's healthcare, whether it's psychiatrists or psychologists in the school system, or whether it's just a food pantry that's there for some of these kids that live in these high poverty areas, I know if we have those in those community schools that I mentioned earlier, but we don't have that throughout the state. And that's how we start. We have those resources for these kids. That's how we start to, and couple that with restorative justice practices. That's how we begin to start to change the dynamics of our students and the way they think and the way they operate in society. And I think those two pieces of legislation will really help further the Black society in the state of Maryland.
So I want to say two things. The first is that, and I'm really appreciative of what Delegate Washington said when he refers to the caucus. He's talking about the Legislative Black Caucus of Maryland, which has untapped power, right? And that really the solution, sustainable solution, because I think it's important that we're not just reactive to issues of injustice, but that we create mechanisms of sustainable power. The caucus, the Legislative Black Caucus of Maryland, is unique that a third of its population is people of African descent, which means that we have a sizable enough representative power politically that if we realize it, right, could run the table. We could make these reforms happen instead of having to ask. The problem, though, is that unfortunately so again, there are two issues. There is the issue of folks thinking about justice from the perspective of having to ask people for it, right? And unfortunately, too many of us are socialized to see justice as a matter of asking people for justice, as opposed to just being able to do it, right? The other piece, though, is that you have a lot of Black folks that operate as individuals, not as a collective, and they get certain benefits. You might get promoted in the legislature if you vote with the leadership on certain things and against other things, right? And so people's trajectory up the ladder in terms of their professional success in many arenas is predicated on whether or not the white folks that control these institutions or finance them approve of the way that you behave politically. So that's important, that in terms of thinking about the way forward is to think about investment. All folks, if they're interested in justice, investing in the institutions that are controlled and owned by Black folks to take the lead on these issues. That bleeds into the second thing I wanted to mention, because I think we have to look at the question of capacity, right? That communities have the wherewithal, they have the intelligence, they have the experience, but oftentimes don't have the resources to be able to have the capacity to address many of these issues, education and otherwise. And a part of why we don't, particularly in the state of Maryland, is, again, there's a joke in the legislature that people don't like to say publicly. They refer to Baltimore, to some extent PG, as the black hole, right? And because you put money there and people say that, money never gets spent correctly. And that's what folks generally say about urban cities. But what people don't realize is that many of the entities that are being funded to address our issues are entities that are controlled by folks not of and from our communities, who usually make exorbitant amounts of money compared to the folks in the communities that they serve, right, in order to render services that people of and from that community could render more effectively and will create an economic basis to sustain the work that they do. And so that's very important. And that's why, just in my opening remarks, it's very important that we're clear about that. Because what we have is a series of causes where there's money in addressing causes, but that does not mean that you're investing in the people to be able to fix those problems so they don't need those grants of that particular cause to fix their issues. And that's a pretty radical paradigm shift in terms of how people are taught to address these issues, but it's really the only way forward that's going to get us some sustainable change.
So, Dayvon, following up on that and sort of returning to your earlier remarks, and you talked about the question of who's wielding sort of institutional power and resources, particularly in a context where there are pronounced racial disparities. And so I want to, have a conversation about, in Baltimore in particular, and sort of thinking very concretely, who should be the agents of change if you're thinking about institutions in Baltimore like the police department, the school system. How should we think about where that should come from?
I mean, certainly, grassroots organizations that have a history and track record of doing work in the community, that have relationships with folks in the communities that they serve. I did a workshop at Johns Hopkins several years ago for their Center for their Urban Health Institute, And the director of who, is a white man who's done work in, public health for several decades. And one of the things he said to me in the workshop, he said, because the point that I made was you have folks institutions that primarily serve black people, and a lot of times the leadership aren't reflective of the folks that they serve. And one of the things he said to me, he said, wow, it never occurred to me that was an issue. Right? And so that's a part of the problem, is that the resources go to folks who have been programmed to see themselves as innately qualified to address people's problems. Instead of being, because you have to imagine, a lot of these folks aren't immersed in the history and the culture of the people they serve, right? In many contexts, I would describe them as people carrying out thought experiments that they, almost the way that people do pets, right? And so it's important, and here's the thing, and I was talking to brother earlier about the fact that if you look at the media and the way the reports about what happens in these cities, you would think that folks in the community aren't doing anything, right? Like, the Baltimore Sun does not do extensive coverage on Tawanda and West Wednesdays and the work that she does, right? The Baltimore Sun, they try as hard as possible not to quote us or to, follow any of the work that we do. And there are a bunch of other organizations that a lot of folks don't know about and are usually people of the community, but you wouldn't know. And so it's important to start there, that the solution isn't something that we're going to think of that people are going to then take and do something with. The solution is going to come with the people in the communities. The best way I like to explain it is the people in our communities are not the problem. We are the solution. And until we change that framework, that we are the solution and not the problem, that we're going to have this continuing wheel of causes that'll lead us really nowhere.
Questions from the audience? I think we have a microphone going around the room.
Once again, I appreciate all of you guys for coming out here to speak today. My name is Leland. I'm a 3 out here at the law school from Baltimore, from over east, Fremont 33rd. Professor, this question is actually for you, and really for all of you guys. As I've been following the trials of the officers who were responsible for the death of Freddie Gray, and I've been following the prosecution, I've been noticing that you alluded to that the prosecution is using new tools to experimenting on new tools to prosecute these police officers. And if they are successful at using these new tools of prosecuting these police officers, then they can use these new tools to prosecute other defendants. And so do we really, and so at what, to what extent do we want to see these officers who were responsible for the death of Freddie Gray to be brought to justice if it means that the prosecutors who already have a huge toolbox have new tools and can then use those same tools to prosecute other defendants in the city of Baltimore?
What's happening with the Baltimore prosecution is that they're determined to convict. And that's something that we don't often see with local prosecutors. One reason we always call for independent prosecutor, a special prosecutor, is because the close working relationship between the local prosecutor and the local police makes it almost impossible for the local prosecutor to vigorously pursue justice and to find out the facts and the evidence. And if the evidence fits conviction, then convict. And if the evidence falls short, then let the public understand why you did not take action when it looked like you should have. So when I go to court now, and I just want to share one thing with you, because the reason that I took such an interest in actually, I do something that most of my colleagues won't do, which is I actually have relations with media. Because what I was looking at with media is that there's 3 or 4 pro-police pundits, experts so-called. Every single day they're out in front of that court. Some of them haven't even been inside the courtroom. From day one, They have been saying, why are you bringing this case? You know, officers have a tough job. They protect people, and there's a lot of pressure that the unions put on the white community to really support them. And I think the privileged black community too, because there's part of that as well. And what they do is they basically threaten to withhold their services unless you guys come out and support us, because we need you now. And what I'm seeing that's different is, I know some of these folks, because Baltimore's a very small legal community, and we know each other. And I'm saying to one guy, why are you out here? Like, you know, what are you doing here? Like, I thought you were, you know, on the side of justice, and just a big smile comes over the face. And I finally said, let me at least try to provide information to the public. I really try not to give a point of view, but there's obviously a point of view in what we all are saying about truth. And it's interesting. I mean, to a fault, I always try to be optimistic about anything, because if I don't, then I lose some of the passion. I lose some of the hope for a better future for all of us. And so when you go into the drugstore, the grocery store, and people are saying, thank you for explaining what happened, or at least what's going on, at least you seem to be able to not just keep saying the same things over and over, that encouraged me to tell all of you that you really have to get involved in the public arena. You have to write the letters to the editor. You have to write the op-eds. You have to call on those talk shows. You have to go to the community and speak to people. Because, you know, it's not just, you know, Dayvon Love and lots of other, you know, people who are going to be out there in the street every week, you know, sort of calling for justice. It's the folks who are quiet and silent. So I think the prosecution tool really comes from the uprising. And I think it comes from the fact that they actually became aware of just how broken and how rigged our pretrial justice system is. And they brought in people that, frankly, have a lot of respect, even if they do things that I don't always agree with, but I think they are determined to gain conviction, and I think that's the tool they're using. They're using the same tool against these police officers that they would be against the ordinary criminal defendants.
Can I chime in there real quick? Yeah, you know, just to add to that, I think it's funny that the professor mentioned that, they wanted the police department wanted an independent prosecutor after Marilyn Mosby said that they're going to charge them. But before then, I proposed a bill that said that we wanted to have an independent prosecutor, and they literally came to my office and said, no, we don't want this bill. Right. We support our state's attorneys. We want our state's attorneys to do the work. They're doing great work. And then soon after the charges, they came out and said, we want an independent prosecutor. That just makes no sense to me, that they're looking at political, something that's going to work for them when it is going to work for them. And I think if this bill would have looked at the same independent prosecutor that would prosecute a state legislator, that looks at us and says, what have they done that investigates our wrongdoings as well and would eventually prosecute us. So we felt like when there's a police homicide that occurs, we wanted an independent person that doesn't have that connection between the state's attorney and the police department, that we want to separate that a bit and make sure that they have this independent issue. I actually looked into a bill last year that would say that I looked into a bill for this year that would actually say that the FOPs can no longer give to state's attorneys. But we looked at the constitutionality of that, and I don't think that passed the muster on that one. So we held off on that one because there was also arguments that Marilyn Mosby accepted some campaign contributions from the FOP, and that there was some things there that probably wouldn't look too good. So I wanted to take that away completely by the bill that I proposed last year. And I think and still, even after this, I still believe that there needs to be independent prosecutors even after this, so that there's an even and fair trial for everyone.
How you guys doing this evening? My name is Stanford Fraser. I'm a third-year law student from Prince George's County, Maryland.
All right.
And my question is, when we're talking about injustice, right, I think of it a lot from like the housing perspective, where you have Baltimore, one of one of the top 6 or 7 hyper-segregated cities in the country. And you also, and you have like Maryland, I think it's the 3rd highest in foreclosures for the past year. And, I think about how do you fix those institutions within the confines, talking about white supremacy, right? So we talk about how, Baltimore City's hypersegregation reflects a lot of the, 1910 ordinance they tried to pass. Or how Prince George's County is high in foreclosures, even with its high wealth rate, because subprime loans were predominantly given to black and brown people. And how that, so my question, we're talking about education, how education is founded through property taxes and how that affects Prince George's County and Baltimore City. And then how segregation and that opportunity affects your transportation options, your job options. So what are we guys doing working on those issues, and how do we think we want to solve those issues?
So, there are a lot of organizations in Baltimore that are working on a myriad of issues. There's an organization called Right to Housing that actually just did a report on rent court and some of the disproportionate treatment in rent court, just in terms of, the frequency where folks get evicted, the lack of protections there are to tenants and whatnot. There are organizations called Equity Matters that's using social determinants of health to work with in tandem with some of the organizations that are doing work on housing. But again, one of the things that I can't stress enough is that we need folks like yourself who are immersed in community to be the folks that are leading the charge on advocacy efforts to address those kinds of issues. Because there are lots of organizations that are doing work and that know a lot of the history, right, that are clear about, the fact. I think between 2007 and 2013, black folks, we lost the most wealth ever, right, as a result of the housing crisis. And that needs to be something that's put to the fore. A part of the problem, though, is that oftentimes that question is not put at the forefront. So I think sometimes we use euphemisms, like disparities, even inequalities, even though it's not really euphemism. But we put phrases that talk about the problem from the vantage point of some kind of objective scientific perspective, as opposed to the question of, how do we build capacity to be able to address whatever problems that exist. And I think that's really should be the central core of how you address any of those problems.
Thank you for the question. Really appreciate that. I work as a delegate. I'm a part-time legislator. We work 90 days out of the year, so full-time job. I'm a affordable housing consultant with the Prince George's County government. And in Prince George's County, we don't have, and I think Baltimore as well, an affordable housing plan or strategy to ensure that affordable housing is available to everyone. But if you dig a little deeper into, I think this happened in Chicago as well, where they take people with Section 8 vouchers and they put them in one area. And they say, well, we want all the poor people in this one area, these poor black people in one area. And then, as you know, you can have probably about 500,000 people in that one area. The crime, and then the crime starts to rise because there's probably about 100 people in there that controls the drug trafficking and controls a lot of the homicides that occur in those areas. And it's funny because we don't, the affordable housing strategy that's occurring, the lack of affordable housing strategy right now has hurt the African American community significantly. The subprime mortgage, that hurt Prince George's County significantly. We're number one in the state in foreclosures, and we're still trying to get ourselves out of it. Our housing values have increased incrementally, and I think we're doing well in selling homes, but we still don't have an affordable housing strategy. Like I said about the Section 8 vouchers that we have and I grew up on Section 8, where, in the state of Maryland, they're in one area, but Montgomery County, which is a very affluent majority area, you can see their Section 8 vouchers. They can live wherever they want throughout the state, throughout the county, because they have a plan there that doesn't allow anyone to discriminate based on this Section 8 voucher, so they can move out to other areas. In the state of Maryland, it's Baltimore City and Prince George's County where these Section 8 vouchers are really you can see a concentration of them in that one area. There's a bill for that this year that the Maryland Black Caucus is going to support, and I support it wholeheartedly, seeing as though I grew up on Section 8, and I want to see there's an equal opportunity for everyone to have a housing wherever they feel like they want to have. And I know you mentioned transportation. I'm going to end on this one too. Transportation is a big deal for low-income communities. In order to get around, some folks don't have cars or access to transportation, and this governor cut millions of dollars from the Purple Line that we're building that will connect inner cities of Prince George's County to Montgomery County. He cut about $700 million from that, and said that the counties have to fork up more money when we're seeing deficits in our budgets. And then he ultimately cut the red line in Baltimore to connect one side of Baltimore to the other side of Baltimore so that folks can get around. He gave the federal government back, this governor gave back the federal government $900 million that the federal government wanted to put on the line for transportation in Baltimore City. Instead, he decided to, instead of saying let's do a $3 billion investment in transportation in Baltimore City, he said let's do a $150 million bus line in Baltimore City instead. And that is not what's going to solve our problem economically, transportation-wise, and even housing. I mean, we need to make sure that we have a real good plan for these issues.
I just want to jump in and say, I think these are really important questions, and also highlight the limits of the law sometimes, right? And I think, there have been cases that our office was involved in challenging the forced segregation in public housing, for example, that I think would be a lot harder to bring now, right? And there's like a fight in Maryland right now in the Baltimore region about ensuring that people in public housing are able to live in areas of opportunity if they choose, and this reaction from the region outside of the city, right? I mean, part of it is like this gets into the geography of opportunity, and that there was white flight, and that the suburb, like in the culture of the suburbs, is this resistance to inclusion. Resistance is it's just racist, right? I mean, there's a belief that we don't. I mean, that in so many parts of our state, there is this like, well, we're not Baltimore thing, right? And I think part of housing and transportation in particular, it's so important that we look at things in a regional framework, not just Baltimore City, right? And a lot of those things require us to update. I'm looking at from the legal toolbox, right? Update our laws. One of the things that is happening in Baltimore to challenge, and I assume Cheryl and I full spoke about this, is the administrative complaint filed with the Office of Transportation regarding denial of the decision not to do the red line, which is again about resources, right? It's about denying resources. And I think it's also really important to acknowledge the history of the denial of resources to Baltimore City, and that and this is where I think that the historical context becomes so important, and also in terms of shaping our understanding of in framing the problem, but also conceptualizing the remedies, and that how many of the problems we face are the result and the legacy and the ongoing manifestation of racism. It's unbelievably obvious when you're in Baltimore, I think, and in the region, it becomes just obvious, and we need to name that, and we need to find ways to make the law enable us to name that and to challenge it as such. And we're really limited in terms of litigation strategies on that front.
I have two questions, so I guess I can just ask them both at the same time. My first question is for you, Delegate Washington. You spoke kind of about the power of the Black Caucus, but I think what we're seeing more and more is that the Black community is not a monolith, and I think my perspective has been that elected representatives, even when accountable to members of the Black community, are maybe accountable to members of the Black community that are maybe a little bit older or a little bit elite, and kind of are advocating for solutions that are often in direct tension to what's going on the ground in a lot of these cities. So my question is kind of, how do you mediate that tension? And also, when we're talking about for example, Dayvon kind of set forth all these other ways that legislative changes could have happened that maybe would have been slightly more radical. And a lot of that is like education based. Like it's hard to know what to ask for, especially if you aren't used to navigating those systems. So how do you kind of try to mediate wanting to be seen as a good advocate and successful delegate while still educating people to demand more from their own represented officials? Then my other question is about being a lawyer. And Dayvon, I really, really liked pretty much everything that you had to say. I hope you'll come by and talk to some students that are occupying the lounge after this. But lawyer, I think in law school, we're oftentimes taught to perpetuate oppressive structures even when we're doing like public interest work. Mm-hmm. So you kind of spoke a little bit about needing to see people within these communities be the solution. You also spoke about kind of white people intervening in racial justice in a way that they seem to think is positive without ever really giving up the privilege that they would need to give up to be free. So I think like in law school, in the classroom, oftentimes we don't even talk about the way the law has disparate impacts. And then when we do, we're assumed to be the experts. And like we're assumed to be the ones that are going to intervene and figure out a way to fix it. Or, you know, we're going to do impact litigation. We're going to find this brilliant legal strategy that's going to like free Black people in this narrow way. So I guess my question for like the lawyers, but also for anybody, and specifically for Ms. Jones, like what ways were lawyers helpful to you, or were they at all? In which ways were they impediments to what you were trying to do? And what are ways as law students we can think about being a lawyer, which I think is, like I said, can be an oppressive position in a way that vibes better with kind of your vision for freedom?
Thank you for your question. Really, that's a really good question, actually, and it's about, you know, we all know essentially know politics plays a game in all this, and as many of us, we have to go back to our district and defend our votes essentially. And for me, I live like I said, I live in northern Prince George's County. I have a very progressive district that's really you know, it's racially diverse and even economically diverse. So I can go back to my district and say I voted for these things and that are really progressive and radical, and they'll say thank you. But if you have another person who lives in the same county but lives in southern Prince George's County that has more of a conservative Democratic base, they have to go back and really defend themselves of why they voted for certain things, and they can be tougher on criminal justice issues. And so it is, and I'll give you a good example where we tried to, where when I wasn't there, they wanted to overturn, allow marriage equality. And there was a delegate in my district who was teetering on the edge because her district kept saying, no, we don't want marriage equality. But the Democratic Party kept on pushing her to do it. And so therefore she did do it, but then she ran for re-election and didn't win. So a lot of these folks, even as Democrats, we have to think about where we live and represent our community, as well as if we want to be as radical as we want to get these changes done. I mean, I can be that way. I can do it. I can say, hey, look, Mr. Speaker, my constituency wants LOBER, law enforcement bill of rights changed completely. And I can go back to my district and say, I did this, and they'll be okay with it. But another person in Prince George's County that lives in the southern parts or even outside the Beltway, where there's more conservative, more affluent African Americans and older African Americans, they could not go back and say, well, I did this. They can't do it. So as a caucus, we even recent in a public meeting, there was delegates there that said that, they want to see us be more tough on crime. Because crime happens everywhere. It happens to African Americans, and they're more conservative and want to see us do more to be more tough on crime. So it's about finding that balance and figuring out how we can do it. That's why I said earlier that we didn't these things aren't necessarily what we wanted to do, these pieces of legislation aren't necessarily the end-all be-all and what we wanted, but it's a step in the right direction. And it's because everyone has to go back to their district. And this is just how politics is played, unfortunately. And this is how they have to represent their community. So I make no excuse for them, but I just tell you that that's what folks have to think about when they go back to represent their community. So you have to be representative of your community. And sometimes you can take that big leap of faith and say, I'm going to do this because I believe in it. And many people have done that and took that big leap. And that's why I convinced that same delegate to vote for the death penalty repeal. At first, he was totally against it. He said, no, we need to keep this. But after a talk with me and a couple others, we got him to vote for that bill. So it's about finding that balance. And like you said, Black people aren't monolithic, so we have to find an even balance between the two. Yeah.
And I want to thank you for that excellent question. And so basically how my lawyer has been helpful to my family, and I'm glad that we do have good lawyers, I think. We have a team of experts. And so the way they've been helpful, because at first they tried, because basically after the state's attorney decided to give all the officers involved in my brother's brutal death full immunity. I was just done, so therefore criminal charges wasn't going to be, ever brought. And that's why we're working so hard to try to open that door. But what my attorneys were able to do, they were trying to keep us on the city level. So they were able instantly to get it on the federal level because they have no caps, even though, like I said, at the end of the day, it's never about income, it's about the outcome. So they have been helping in ways that you guys can help. It's kind of providing information about police brutality and things like that, because when a person's family is experiencing this, it's so many avenues to turn, and we're stuck which way do we go? So to kind of narrate that and tell us which direction to go will be very helpful.
I just wanted to say one thing about law students. I just came back from something called the Robert Cover Public Interest Retreat. And it's held every year in New Hampshire. There were about 200 law students there, and it was all for practicing lawyers who are doing different kinds of human rights work. If you want that support, that encouragement, that nurturing and mentoring and everything that you need to really overcome law school, and what most law schools teach is that they value property over people. And so in many different ways, that's a presentation that's made as a dominant ideology. I think just coming back from a group where there was just so many people who were inspiring, so many law students who really found that place to be an area where they could actually live their dreams. I think those are the things you want to do as a law student all the time, is get outside of this law school, or bring people like some of the people on this panel, but bring life to your work, bring people to your work, and you'll find that there are really a substantial number of lawyers that don't buy into that dominant ideology.
I would just quickly say, immerse yourselves in the community you want to serve. And if you look out for them, they'll look out for you, and you'll have the kind of bond to be able to potentially build something that the community can take ownership of and feel like these are folks that have our interests at heart.
I think we have time for one more question, and then I may ask one more just to end the panel. But
Hi. So I actually wanted to bounce off of Rena's second question and ask a little more specifically, and this is partially selfish because I will be working as a public defender next year in Maryland. And so I want to know what you specifically think about the role of the public defender in all of this. We talk a lot about public defenders helping push clients along or sort of helping the system continue as it is. And so I just wanted to hear from you all about your experience with public defenders and where you think there's the opportunity to be radical.
Can I take it? Absolutely. Is it okay? So, I was a New York City public defender. They call them legal aid lawyers. It's the same thing. And I have to tell you that, legal aid lawyers, public defenders can be as good as some are or as bad as some are. And what you really have to bring to your work is an understanding that you're not going to find necessarily what you think is there. You're not going to find lawyers who are committed, working hard. I mean, not everyone is led by management that is encouraging you to challenge the system, to take on the system, to really fight against the injustices and the wrongs that you will see many times every day. So what you either have to do is to find kindred spirits like yourself, who are not only interested in being zealous for the individual client, but who want to challenge all of the existing injustices that you are able to do. You have to really create a healthy work environment, because public defenders, I mean, there are some, you can mention D.C. or you can mention Philadelphia or you can mention some that really create a spirit of a fighting spirit. And then there are others where you will be discouraged from doing anything that's going to upset or rock the boat a bit. And I just think what's healthiest for you is to appreciate what you're capable of doing for the individual, but that you're going to need to get a critical mass of people together in order to identify the issues and then work to change the system. Because otherwise, the most that's going to happen is, and this is not a small thing, it's a big thing, but the most that's going to happen is that you're going to be very helpful to select individuals that are lucky enough to have you as their lawyer. But right next to you are going to be 3 other people, that go home every day at 4 o'clock, that think all their clients are guilty, that don't give a damn about really what they need to do, and that's going to hold you back. So try your best. You'll always find good lawyers, good people in every place. You may not find as many as you'd like, but just attract yourself to those and then find folks on the outside also who are going to support what you're doing.
I have never been a public defender, so I can't speak to that. But I think by asking the questions, by being here, you're already sort of putting yourself, you're separating yourself. Maybe I think, when I think of a lot of times I'm asked to help people find lawyers, and I can, and a lot of times I send them to public defenders. But then I'm following the case, and I think that the most valuable thing you can do is really be there for your client as much as you can. I don't know if that's what they teach you in public defender school or not. I think, but I think, and taking each client as an individual with their own humanity and with their own resources and their own challenges is, really making sure that your client believes that you're fighting for them is something really powerful, and really affects how people, the hope that I think somebody feels in that situation. But I also think in terms of, because of what you see as a public defender, you are, just by virtue of your job, you're witnessing so much, and you will develop over time a sense of, I think, systemic issues that you think are really need addressing. And all I ask is that you reach out to others to help make us aware of those things, things that I might not ever know. And I think that's something that's very hard to find time to do as a public defender. Where are you going to be, by the way?
Either in Baltimore or PG County, I don't know yet.
Okay.
And I just want to jump in and say that, I know a lot of people that had to use, I never needed one, thank goodness, but they always say that they don't do good. So my thing is, give it your best, give it your all, because the community needs you. That's right. We need you real bad. Be that different. Connect with the community. So when you start, you need to really literally come and connect with the community and what you're going to be serving, because it's very important. So ask yourself, am I going to be a public defender or a public pretender? And the reason why I say public pretender, because they pretend to have your best interest at heart, and it's like, oh, you're just another case, and they don't do nothing for you. So give it your best.
I know at least a couple of the panelists have flights to catch, so I think we should end here. But please join me in thanking everyone for this discussion.